it is true, of course, that Indonesia is unique, Southeast Asia is unique, but, you know, I'm sure it's no more unique than Brazil or Ghana or West Africa and so on, right? So, in fact, one of the things that strikes me when studying, the unique circumstances, political history, political phenomenon in a country like Indonesia is how many resonances we can see if we read widely.
This is Southeast Asia from the ground up. I'm your host, Emir. I'm here with Professor Edward Aspinall, Professor of Politics at the Department of Political and Social Change, ANU. Hi, Ed. How are you?
Good, thanks. Great to be with you.
Yes, I'm quite excited just to talk to you about thinking about research, thinking about how we approach this very diverse, very large region called Southeast Asia, right? But before we talk a little bit about substance, I would like to just ask you a very generic questions about what initially drew you to Southeast Asia and particularly Indonesia as a region of study, and what about this place that sustained your interest for so long?
Right. Okay, so there are two different questions, really. So the first one, what drew me to Indonesia, it's like with many foreigners who've done research in the region. For me, it was like a childhood experience. So I lived in Indonesia when I was a teenager with my parents. My father was an agricultural scientist, and I spent a bit of my kind of mid-teenage years in the city of Malang in East Java. And from there, I went back to Australia, learned the Indonesian language at high school, university. So I really had an Indonesian studies major throughout my undergraduate years. And it was just that that experience, that ability, particularly to know a language very well and to be able to draw on those language skills in order to interact with people who were engaged in politics. This was still in the period of the New Order regime, so in the authoritarian era, and discuss with them about how they viewed politics, how they engaged politically. So that was the beginning of the story. In terms of sustaining interest over this long period, well, I mean, one of the things about having a country specialization is that if that country changes a lot, and if there's a lot going on in that country, there's always things to sort of renew your interest. So I often think about how it would have been a very different experience to be an Indonesia specialist if I'd done my research in, say, my PhD in like 1970 or something. And then you'd have this long period of basically a pretty unchanging authoritarian regime for several decades. Whereas for me, my early research was on democratization and the struggle against authoritarianism. Then I became very interested for a while in issues to do with ethnic politics. I wrote a book on the Aceh conflict, which erupted in the aftermath of Indonesia's democratization. And then, looking back again at national politics, I became very interested in this issue of clientelism, money politics, vote buying, which was, really characteristic of how electoral politics in the country evolved. So that's one of the good things I think about being an area specialist or a regional specialist. You get this ability to use the area or country-specific skills you have to engage with these very different fields of political inquiry. As the country you're interested in also goes through these, historical changes.
Do you find all those conflicts, democratizations, ethnic studies have some sort of red thread or some sort of connection? Or is it really about the passion for Indonesia and passions for the area?
Yeah, for me, it was always being led from one topic to another by my experiences in the field, right? So, for example, I became very interested in Aceh when during the Indonesia's 1999 elections, the first post-Suharto democratic elections, I had this opportunity to visit that province as an election observer. So, and then the conflict was beginning to erupt. There was a lot of violence taking place. People didn't really know what was happening. And so that led me to study that issue. Similarly, I became very interested in the issue of money politics, the relationship between business and politics, these sorts of issues, as the Aceh peace process unfolded, and as a lot of these former combatants who'd been involved in the insurgency transformed into political actors, into politicians, into political candidates who were engaging or at least having to adapt to this dominant sort of ethos of politics that was Indonesia-wide. So I guess I was being led by my sort of field experiences from topic to topic, but that gives you the opportunity to engage in these very different bodies of literature.
Definitely. I actually remember I was visiting Aceh in 2014 for a research, and I read your, I believe it's East-West monograph on Aceh, and I remember thinking that it was quite grassroots the way you wrote it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like your subsequent body of work also has the same lens in a way, like a very bottom-up case study, grassroots, underscoring their experiences. If that's the case, what is the value of analysis rooted in that kind of localized empirical data, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to understand politics, I think we really need to understand how it's experienced by the people who engage in it. However we understand politics and so on, whatever we think the political project to be, in order to really understand how a political system works or how a particular component or method that's used within a political system operates, my approach at least is to really come to grips with how people who are directly engaged themselves understand what they're doing, how they think of their motivations, why do they do things this way rather than that way. And I find that just firstly, it's very enjoyable, but also very intellectually rewarding, because you can often find these interesting resonances with the literature. So I'll give you an example. Doing this research on vote buying and money politics, one of the big sort of theoretical questions arises in the literature on this field is, if you're handing out money to people to vote for you, how do you enforce that exchange, right? If there's a secret ballot, right? And it turns out, if you do research on that topic, you can just ask people. You can ask politicians. You just put the question to them as a hypothetical. If you're distributing this money, how can you try and enforce that? And you get these fascinating responses and these techniques that sort of draw you deeper and deeper into the techniques of politics as practiced on the ground, and that's what I really love doing.
Yes. And that's actually my next question as well, because in your book, for example, Money Politics, Patronage, Clientelism at the Grassroots Level, the answer of this quite broad questions of how do Indonesian politicians win elections was presented through a series of case studies, right? Are you often worried about this pitfall of case elections bias, for example, or this particularity of certain cases, right? Do you find it challenging to draw a broader perspective from a rather specific case?
Not really. I mean, I know that's probably not a politically correct answer for a lot of contemporary political science, where there's a lot of sometimes crippling concern, a sort of crippling level of concern about case selection and so on. My feeling is that by diving into a particular case, let's say a regional case within Indonesia, so long as you're rooted in a more general understanding of how political developments or how political logic operate in other parts of the country, you can have a high degree of confidence about generalizing from that experience. And then the next step is to ensure that you can connect your findings to broader comparative literature. And that means looking well beyond the Indonesian case. In this case, to look at case studies of how this sort of politics operates in other parts of the world, and to be able to find the differences and similarities and then build from those in order to develop a more persuasive, thoroughgoing argument. Of course, like, you know, when we do design a big project, and in the end we did design a very big project on clientelism, not only in Indonesia but across Southeast Asia, sure, we do pay a lot of attention to case selection, you know, organising these big teams, ensuring that we're selecting case study locations that represent the diversity of, you know, urban, rural, different political characteristics, centre, periphery, etc. within a country. But I think that often depth provides a lot of intellectual leverage to engage comparatively and theoretically.
Yeah. I believe that's also a similar point of Slater and Ziblatt.
Right.
In one of their articles saying, well, if we can generate theory of democracy from Italy, why can't we generate theory of politics from such a diverse region like Southeast Asia or Indonesia even.
Exactly.
But having been researching Southeast Asia for so long, and Indonesia in particular, what do you find unique in a way about researching this region? And do you believe that this uniqueness somehow, I suppose, make it difficult to derive those observations because they are quite Southeast Asia unique, or actually quite useful in thinking about broader theory of politics?
Yeah, I would say more the latter. I mean, it is true, of course, that Indonesia is unique, Southeast Asia is unique, but, you know, I'm sure it's no more unique than Brazil or Ghana or West Africa and so on, right? So, in fact, one of the things that strikes me when studying, you know, the unique circumstances, political history, political phenomenon in a country like Indonesia is how many resonances we can see if we read widely and we read the comparative literature. So I talked earlier about my research on Aceh, and so one of the things I did in that research was develop a sort of historical understanding of how this movement of Achenese nationalism had come into being. And one of the really striking things there was just how similar this was in so many of its characteristics to, say, you know, 19th century anti-imperial nationalism in Europe or whatever, right? You can find all these echoes of cognate political phenomena in other parts of the world, or vote buying in Indonesia versus vote buying in Brazil or Peru. There are so many different patterns which, to me, vote buying, for example, is a classic example. This is something which is, you can't get more sort of local and improvised than how politicians, you know, learn how to distribute cash in exchange for votes. There's no guidebooks on this. There's no, you know, UN agencies going around training politicians how to do this sort of thing. And yet it's sort of almost uncanny the way that the techniques that and the challenges that politicians confront in developing this mode of politics, how similar they are, right, in many different parts of the world. So that's one of the fascinating things, I think, about doing this sort of deeper research, that sure, you need to come to grips with what's unique about the political history, culture, circumstances of the country you're studying, but you find these echoes and similarities right across the globe as political actors confront similar sorts of sets of incentives, similar sorts of political structures, similar challenges, and so on.
With this, a lot of diversity and so much going on in Southeast Asia, where do you begin when conceptualizing research project on Southeast Asia? Are you primarily driven by these empirical puzzles or the experiences you get from the field, or is it mostly like you attend a conference and inspired by the scholarly debate in that conference? How do you usually conceptualize a research project?
So I would say that the trigger would generally be some real-world puzzle or question that one encounters in the field or through one's reading of political developments. This is for me. But then the refinement of that research project always occurs through a process of dialogue between the theory and the empirical findings, the fieldwork findings, and so on. That the way we shape the questions that we ask about this puzzling situation we confront in the field is generally a response to a theoretical literature as well, right? So fieldwork observations lead one towards deepening one's reading on a particular topic that gives you new insights, new questions to ask, which often do resonate with your own fieldwork findings. Then the things that you find in the field that don't quite fit with the existing theoretical literature then allow you to sharpen your contribution, right? Because it's often between that disjuncture between what you find in the field and what you read in the literature that allows you to identify and develop your own distinctive take on that topic and make a contribution to the broader literature. So I think it's really a process. For me, it's a process of dialogue, really. Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting way to put it. And when thinking about methodology, you have collaborated as well with some big survey scholars like Burhanuddin Muhtadi from Indikator Politik, right? And employed that kind of large end survey to your research. How do you position such an approach? Do you find that complementary to your case studies, or thinking about it more from testing hypothesis? How do you think about this large end study, and how does it fit into your kind of approach that is quite localized?
Yeah, I mean, it's varied, and it's a part of the field of Indonesian studies that's changed a lot. For the study of Indonesia, at least, it's changed a lot since I began my career, because basically under Suharto, it wasn't really possible to do those sorts of that sort of polling, particularly on political questions. So for me, I'm often looking for the use of that survey material. You're often looking for, certainly I do work with more quantitatively oriented scholars who will, identify particular hypotheses. So Burhan, for example, Burhanuddin Muhtadi, you mentioned, really wanted to drill down into how and why vote buying can be an effective way of winning elections, and he developed a number of hypotheses he tested. For me, it's I guess in general it would be more supplementary, right? It's about more understanding the dimensions of a particular problem, understanding some possible sort of interactions between different components of basically public opinion or features of Indonesian society and political attitudes towards a particular problem. We recently did some research on patriarchal attitudes and voting for women candidates, for example, which really was able to identify, what sorts of people are less or more likely to vote for women candidates. So for me, overall, given my history, my background, my sort of predilections, I would view it as supplementary, but I work a lot with people for whom that is their primary method.
Yes, and I know that these questions probably very depend on people kind of questions, but when would you advise the usage of each method, like this qualitative and quantitative divide? Is that really a research question dependent, or do you find one more effective for certain project than the other?
I used to feel that there was a real divide between the sort of research I did, which was much more grassroots, qualitative, interviewing people engaged in political activities sort of on the ground. And we were doing this research in Central Java on vote buying. And it happened that one of my collaborators, Alan Hicken, from University of Michigan, was with us on this particular field trip. And one of the things we kept hearing from a lot of the political candidates we were encountering was that they developed these lists of voters, right, who pledged to basically to vote for them in exchange for money. I would never have thought to ask this question, but Alan did because he has this sort of training. How about if we try and collect some of these vote buying lists and then do surveys of the people on them? And that actually turned out to be able to tell us an awful lot about how targeting works, how effective the targeting was. I mean, we were able to find out, for example, a lot about how vote buying is often quite ineffective, in fact, that people are giving a lot of, distributing a lot of money to people on these lists, but a lot of them are not voting for them, in other words. So I think there's a lot that can be done, even in the sort of more political ethnography sort of world that I operate within, that if you're creative and you're not closed-minded towards those sort of methods, you can draw upon them. Because, I mean, one of the things that people who do the sort of qualitative research I often do is they often rail against, you know, the hegemony of quantitative methods and positivism and so on. But I find that often we're just as bad, right? That people who do this sort of work are often very dismissive of that more quantitatively oriented scholarship and methodologies, which we can actually learn a lot from. So I'm all for letting 1,000 flowers bloom methodologically and people to creatively draw upon different methods when they can. Now, in terms of students and so on, yeah, of course, particular projects will lend themselves to particular methods. But my feeling is that people should try to be as open-minded and eclectic as they can in terms of coming at a particular question from different angles, drawing upon different methods.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But also even with one's methodology, for example, because I was in the Philippines late last year, and I remember I started asking these questions of, what do you think of this president? What do you think of that president? What do you think of Duterte? What do you think of Marcos? And then people's opinion are very divided, right? And I was like, oh, okay, how do I judge that? Right. And as a result, I was like, oh, maybe I'm asking the wrong question. Maybe I should ask less about the personalities, more about the process, and correcting my kind of questionings, right? Have you ever been in the field and started realizing, I'm asking the wrong questions to these people?
Yeah, I'm sure I have. I mean, yeah, I'm sure I have, and particularly on these issues where there are particular political sensitivities involved. I think that's often a very delicate one. That there are, you know, particular topics. There was a lot of this in Aceh, for example, which is an area which had a history of violence and, you know, fairly, you know, exclusionary sorts of politics, where if you address some of these issues frontally, you just wouldn't really get much of an answer at all. But there are ways to, you know, win trust or ask indirectly. I mean, that's more a issue of sort of interview technique, I suppose. Yeah, but I'm sure I must have, you know, one is constantly reevaluating the questions one asks, yeah, and the approaches one's use, yeah.
But what about if with the trajectory of the research itself, do you find it useful to reevaluate the kind of question you ask, the kind of methodology you employed after a field trip?
Yeah, I mean, usually one is sort of reevaluating it as one goes. But there's a lot of sort of following one's nose while one is in the field. So you go to the field thinking you're really there to, I don't know, study the politics of ethnicity in a particular province, but you find out as you get into it that in fact there's a different story there, right? Which could be about the relationship between, you know, the politics of mining and ethnic politics in that place, for example. So there's a lot of, I would say, across the course of my career, there were a lot of research projects that started out as one thing and then ended up as something completely different, right? And that, you know, probably at least half of the publications I've written across the course of my career were not the publications I was planning to. They weren't the things that were in the research proposal, yeah. But something that evolved from that process of dialogue between theory and empirical encounters that I mentioned before.
Definitely. So that dialogue part is exactly. quite key. And I remember as well, I just returned from Jakarta 2 weeks ago, and I was actually there with another PhD student from PSC, and we were at some point just getting a drink and started like, okay, we are bombarded by all this information left and right, and naturally when you're in the field, right, there's all this series of interesting things. And how do you process this information, especially when not all of them are relevant, some of them are relevant, but you are exposed to, there's not really like this gateway, right? The gatekeeper that kind of like, here's the information you need for this. How do you usually process all this millions of information you encounter in the field?
Yeah. I mean, that's often, a task for when one gets back and one starts to write the material up in ways that, but again, I mean, I guess the critical answer would be that, again, it really depends on that process of dialogue between what you're encountering in the field and the big questions that are out there in the theoretical literature. So the tendency would be then to focus on those aspects of these really diverse, complex, interesting stories that you get in ways that zero in on those bigger questions that you're interested in. I think that's the way to do it, right? Now, it might be that you are finding answers that don't fit the conventional theoretical framework, and that doesn't mean you abandon them. Of course, that's even more of an incentive to drill down into them. But I think that's how I would be guided, that often you encounter material that is interesting but is extremely detailed on issues which aren't really related to your primary theoretical or research interests. Make a note of them, put them to one side, think about them later, but really try to home in on those issues which you think will allow you to make a contribution. And I think often the big question that needs to guide us is what is going to be of interest to people who don't just study Indonesia or Malaysia or Philippines or whatever. I think that's often where that's the pitfall at the sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, I guess. From one is this sort of disembodied theorizing that's not grounded in people's experiences of politics. The other is that we develop a story that's primarily about a local or a national history that can't speak to these concerns that scholars working on other parts of the world would have. I think that's the critical thing, and for me that's what theory is about, right? What is it that you can develop? What findings can you develop from your research? What ideas can you develop from your research that you can offer to the world of scholarship at large, and for people who are engaged, interested in cognate political topics, but in Ghana or Tanzania or wherever it would be, right? Yeah.
Led you to have a better dialogue when you're in the field too, right? Exactly. Like it points you to what kind of questions you can ask, and then as a dialogue you also started thinking, oh, this is how I should ask this question.
Exactly. And often you can, even when you're interviewing your interlocutors, people are often interested to respond to those sorts of questions as well. You can say, if you're talking to like a village head or whoever it is in Indonesia, for example, you can say, well, the sort of politics I'm familiar in Australia, people would think it would be normal to do A, B, and C, but here you're doing D. So what is it about your context that makes this the right way to go or the logical way to go? And people often actually enjoy that sort of discussion because it's an opportunity for them to explain, maybe, a political activity or a way of doing things that they've sort of taken for granted themselves their whole lives, right? So often they're the sort of conversations I really enjoy having with people in the field as well.
Definitely. Before we move on to this a topic about the field, right? Southeast Asian studies. Just last questions on this method. Can you paint a picture of your field work, right? You're in Jakarta, your first day in Jakarta. What is your process usually? Are you started like calling up different people and try to meet as many people as possible? Are you more purposeful on that? Or, are you trying to, before that, situate yourself and understand the political situations? Like what will be your first day in Jakarta looks like when you are starting this research project?
So this has changed a lot over the course of my career, right? So early on, say when I was doing my PhD or early post-PhD, I would go to Indonesia with a very well-developed sort of set of core questions and basically a target list of people I wanted to interview to at least begin the process. Of course, then there would be snowballing and all of that, and we'd get more deeply into a topic. And I would often go in cold, or I'd be able to draw on existing relationships I had with colleagues there. Now, as I become more senior, as I've made so many trips to Indonesia and developed such wide research networks there now, my method is quite different in that I'm usually now engaged in these bigger scale research projects with Indonesian colleagues. So now we'd often bring a group of the typical pattern I do now is to work with colleagues from Indonesian universities, especially regional universities, on a particular topic, bring a team together for a workshop. We think about the research project together. We develop these research protocols together. And now, in fact, when I do my field work, I'm often doing it with these colleagues from different parts of Indonesia. So that's a wonderful experience because you get to learn from them. You get to draw upon their local knowledge and their local networks, but usually then we work together in co-publishing, or I help edit their material for English language publication, whatever, right? So that's a really good part of the experience that has changed a lot over the course of my career.
Yes. And that leads me to the next questions about Southeast Asian studies as a field, right? It was quite interesting from just listening from your point of views as well, and on how the field has changed, what you can do in Indonesia has changed, right? And but what about just Southeast Asian studies as a field? Do you think it's changing, and where is the cutting edge of the research, if I can ask that kind of question?
Yeah, I think it's a challenging question to answer because I think it has changed a lot again over the course of my career. I feel that the field has diversified a lot and is much bigger, right? So for someone like me who works on politics, it used to be more or less, I mean, it was probably always a bit of an illusion, but we always used to think, I'm going to really try and keep up to date on all the big books on politics in Southeast Asia. And for me, that meant sort of, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore. But that's much more difficult now. And I guess there was a much bigger, or a primary focus, an overwhelming focus on sort of big meta-political questions, nature of the regime, authoritarianism, regime change, and so on. But I think partly as a result of Southeast Asian countries opening up, although that's maybe not quite as strong a factor now, but certainly the diversification of methods and so on, it's just much harder to try and be able to keep up, or to zero in on that, very core group of works on these big issues to do with regime, the nature of regimes and regime change. It's just a much more diverse field made of interesting sort of subfields. The literature on ethnic politics is perhaps much more disembodied now than it used to be from literature on the nature of regimes. There's distinctive fields of work on clientelism, grassroots politics, and so on. So it's just I think the field is much more much harder to grasp than it used to be, which is a good thing.
Yeah, in a way. But do you also experience it to be siloed, or are they actually talking to each other and informing each other's approach?
Yeah, probably less than it used to be. I think there's probably a bit less cross-fertilization than it used to be, partly as a result of this diversification I've talked about. I mean, there's still scope for that. So if you work on, say, subnational or local politics in Thailand or Indonesia, I'm sure people are still reading a lot about the Philippines. But it is difficult to do really genuinely comparative work, across a significant number of countries. I mean, that is one of the distinctive things about Southeast Asian studies, a field that we know about, of course, that, if you're working on Latin America, for example, or Francophone Africa, at least linguistically, you have greater access to different countries. Whereas for working, shifting between Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines is much more challenging, at least as an individual researcher. You can still do it as part of collaborative research. So there are sort of structural challenges to doing that, I feel.
Yeah, definitely. And the next question is partly inspired by Dave Kang article in International Security called Getting Asia Wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And obviously that article was written in response to the frustrations of the scholarly debate in IR specifically, right? And how that is actually a wrong question to ask about Southeast about Asia, not Southeast Asia in particular. But in your experience, for example, in this whole like clientelism, oligarchy, obviously you're right, you contributed quite a lot with the clientelism theory, but you also criticized quite a lot. Do you find it, this Western-derived theory and debate, do you find it frustrating? Do you find it stimulating? Have they led us sometimes asking the wrong questions about Southeast Asia?
I don't really feel that, and I feel that some of these, say, oligarchy theory, clientelism theory, it's not quite right. I don't think that they are purely Western-derived theories. I mean, these were bodies of theoretical literature that are informed in part by observations of political developments in Southeast Asia. Some of James Scott's work on clientelism, for example, sure, he was drawing on Italian and other material, but obviously he was also drawing on his encounters in the field in Southeast Asia. So for me, it's just, at least I'm a domestic politics person, so I wouldn't want to comment on the IR field, but yeah, I haven't really encountered sustained or convincing critiques that would suggest that that it's not useful to try and position developments in Southeast Asian politics in terms of a wider universe of global political comparative studies, right? That's what it is, basically, right? Because, as I said before, right, we can observe a lot of those echoes with political developments we see in other parts of the world. So for me, it's not this sort of dichotomous thing about rejecting externally derived theories or developing purely, Southeast Asia derived theories. It's this question of finding that space or adapting those theories to the Southeast Asian realities we find in the field, testing them and adapting them where necessary, right? I think that, and making a contribution, right? That's the thing. I mean, why is it that we have to position Southeast Asia as a recipient of theory, that we can also be producing theory out of Southeast Asian studies that can then help us understand political developments in other parts of the world?
Yes, that's quite fascinating. And if I can ask these last questions, especially for scholars and students who aspire to study Southeast Asia, right? How should we ask better questions when we research Southeast Asia?
Well, I'm probably going to start sounding like a broken record here now, because I think it really does come back to that dialogue I was talking about on-the-ground knowledge of Southeast Asian political structures, developments, traditions, etc., and theory. I think one of the problems you sometimes see is when someone will just derive a question that comes from the latest theoretical developments in their field, and you can see that it obviously hasn't been matched to the Southeast Asian circumstances. So that sort of question is not going to give you an interesting line of inquiry. But the other extreme, which we often see, again, I'm an Indonesia specialist, so I often work with Indonesian scholars, and many of whom haven't had the opportunity to be exposed a lot to comparative political theory. So the other extreme is just asking these questions that are very specific, very focused on political developments in a very particular location that doesn't speak to the broader theory. So the trick is that to develop interesting questions, you have to know quite a lot about what's going on in your topic area, in the field, and yet also be immersed in the relevant theoretical literature. And then it's finding that often the most interesting questions are that sort of areas of, mismatch or a puzzle that arises from the collision between these two. Theoretical expectations are that in circumstances A, B, and C, we will find outcome X, but look, in Indonesia, it's not like that. Now, why would that be? Often that's the starting point for a good question.
Thank you so much, Ed. And this is Southeast Asia from the ground now.